The most dangerous prisoner in the galaxy has never harmed a single person. Ethan Walker first heard those words on a cold Tuesday morning, and the way the old maintenance supervisor said them made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Not because of the words themselves, because of the silence that followed. The shuttle descended through layers of gray clouds, its engines humming against the endless storms surrounding Helios Correctional Complex. Through the reinforced window, Ethan watched flashes of distant lightning dance across jagged mountain peaks. The prison sat alone on a barren plateau nearly 3 miles above sea level, surrounded by black stone cliffs and weather systems violent enough to tear ordinary aircraft from the sky. It looked less like a prison and more like a fortress built to keep something terrible locked away forever. Ethan adjusted the collar of his dark work jacket and glanced at the digital assignment packet resting on his lap. Systems Maintenance Specialist. Level 3 Security Clearance. Temporary 6-month contract. The pay was nearly double what he had earned anywhere else, which should have made him happy. Instead, a strange uneasiness settled in his chest as the massive facility grew larger beneath them. The prison stretched for nearly half a mile, a maze of steel towers, reinforced walls, and glowing energy barriers. White floodlights pierced the storm-darkened morning. Antenna arrays rose into the clouds like skeletal fingers. Everything about the place felt heavy, permanent, as if the building itself had forgotten what freedom looked like. "First time on Helios?" the shuttle pilot asked. Ethan nodded. "That obvious?" The older man chuckled without humor. "Everyone has the same look." "What look?" The pilot stared through the windshield, like they're wondering if they should have stayed home. Ethan smiled politely, but the comment lingered. 40 minutes later, he stepped through the main security checkpoint. Layers of scanning equipment surrounded him. Metal doors hissed open and shut. Automated announcements echoed through the corridors. Somewhere deep within the complex, machinery groaned like a sleeping giant. The air smelled faintly of ozone, recycled ventilation, and cold steel. A security officer escorted him through multiple checkpoints before arriving at maintenance operations. There, a gray-haired supervisor named Raymond Cole handed him a tablet filled with repair requests. "Most systems here are older than they look," Cole said. "Generators, climate control, surveillance grids. Keep them running, and everyone stays happy." Ethan scrolled through the list. Hundreds of routine maintenance tasks. Nothing unusual, until he noticed a section highlighted in red. Sector 7. Restricted access. "What's Sector 7? He asked. The room became noticeably quieter. A technician across the room stopped typing. Another looked away. Raymond took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Not your concern." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Then why is it on my assignment list?" The older man stared at the screen for several seconds. "Because eventually every maintenance worker gets sent there." The answer somehow created more questions. "What's inside?" Raymond leaned back in his chair. Rain rattled softly against the reinforced windows behind him. For a moment, it seemed like he was deciding whether to speak at all. Then he lowered his voice. "A prisoner." Ethan shrugged. "This is a prison. Not like this one." Raymond's expression hardened. "Cell 47. Deepest level of Sector 7. 1 inmate. Solitary containment. 12 years. Ethan frowned. 12 years. No visitors. No transfers. No hearings. No exceptions. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly. Somewhere down the corridor, a distant door slammed shut. "What did she do?" Ethan asked. Raymond looked toward the hallway as though making sure nobody else could hear. Then he said something that stayed with Ethan for the rest of the day. "Nobody knows." Outside, another bolt of lightning illuminated the prison walls. The thunder rolled across the mountains seconds later. And somewhere far below the fortress, behind layers of steel and locked doors, the most feared prisoner in the galaxy waited alone in Cell 47. By the end of his first week, Ethan Walker had learned 2 things about Helios Correctional Complex. The first was that every hallway had a story nobody wanted to tell. The second was that Cell 47 was the one story everyone avoided. The prison operated on routines precise enough to measure by the second. Lights brightened at 6 every morning. Supply transports arrived every Wednesday. Maintenance reports were filed every night before 2200 hours. Yet whenever Sector 7 appeared on a schedule, conversations stopped. I shifted away. People suddenly found reasons to leave the room. Ethan noticed it over lunch one afternoon. The cafeteria overlooked the eastern cliffs through thick reinforced glass. Rain streaked down the windows while distant thunder rolled across the mountains. He sat with a tray of reheated pasta and coffee that tasted vaguely like burnt plastic. Across from him sat a young systems technician named Marcus. They had spent most of the week repairing environmental controls together. Marcus was friendly enough until Ethan casually mentioned Sector 7. The technician nearly dropped his fork. "Do not go looking for answers down there," Marcus said quietly. "Why?" Ethan asked. "Because nobody who works there stays long." Ethan frowned. "You make it sound haunted." Marcus forced a laugh, but it sounded strained. "Maybe it is." Before Ethan could ask another question, the technician stood up and carried his tray away. That was how most conversations ended. Half-finished. Uncomfortable. Like everyone knew something they wished they did not know. 3 days later, Ethan finally received his first assignment connected to the restricted sector. The notification appeared on his tablet just after dawn. Maintenance inspection. Sublevel 7. Ventilation diagnostics. Authorization approved. He stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he grabbed his toolkit and headed for the elevator. The lower levels of Helios felt different from the rest of the prison. The air grew colder with every floor. The walls became thicker. Security checkpoints appeared more frequently. By the time he reached Sublevel 7, he had passed through 4 separate identity scans and 2 armed security stations. The elevator door slid open. With a metallic hiss, silence greeted him. Not normal silence. Heavy silence. The kind that made every footstep sound louder than it should. Long white lights stretched overhead. The corridor seemed endless. Ethan followed the maintenance markers on his tablet until he reached a sealed access door. Sector 7. Authorized personnel only. He pressed his identification badge against the scanner. Locks disengaged one by one with deep mechanical clicks. The door opened slowly. Cold air drifted outward. The ventilation system beyond was older than the rest of the facility. Pipes lined the ceiling. Emergency lights cast pale reflections across steel walls. Ethan knelt beside a maintenance panel and began running diagnostics. The work itself was routine. Pressure readings, airflow measurements, system calibration. The kind of job he could practically do in his sleep. Then he heard it. At first he thought it was part of the ventilation system. A faint sound hidden beneath the steady hum of machinery. Soft, distant, almost impossible to identify. Ethan paused and listened. There it was again. Not machinery, not alarms. Music. He slowly stood. The sound drifted through the corridor like a whisper. A voice. Singing. The melody was unfamiliar. Gentle. Melancholy. Beautiful in a way he could not explain. The notes echoed through the steel passageways as though they had nowhere else to go. Ethan checked the corridor. Empty. No guards. No staff. Only the song. He followed it without thinking. One turn led to another. Then another. The sound grew clearer. Eventually he reached a reinforced security gate unlike any he had seen before. Beyond it stretched a short hallway ending at a single massive door. Cell 47. The voice stopped. Silence returned instantly. Ethan stared at the door. Thick steel. Multiple locking systems. Observation cameras positioned at every angle. A small digital display glowed beside the frame. Occupancy confirmed. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Then a strange feeling settled over him. Not fear. Not danger. Loneliness. As though the silence behind that door weighed more than all the steel surrounding it. Somewhere beyond the reinforced walls, someone had been singing to an empty hallway. And for the first time since arriving at Helios, Ethan found himself wondering not what was inside Cell 47, but how long a person could remain alone before silence became their only companion. The image stayed with Ethan all night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the silent corridor, the sealed door, and the strange loneliness that seemed to linger around it like cold air. By morning, curiosity had settled into something stronger. During breakfast, he found himself studying old facility maps on his tablet instead of eating. During maintenance inspections, he caught himself glancing towards security checkpoints that led deeper underground. By late afternoon, a winter storm had wrapped itself around the prison. Rain hammered the outer walls. Wind howled through the mountain passes. The entire complex vibrated faintly beneath the pressure of the weather. Ethan was replacing a damaged sensor array when an emergency maintenance request appeared on his screen. Sector 7. Observation Systems. Priority 2. He stared at the notification for several seconds. Then he grabbed his toolkit and headed for the lower levels. The elevator descended through layers of reinforced concrete and steel. Floor numbers disappeared one by one. The deeper he traveled, the quieter everything became. By the time the doors opened, only the distant hum of generators remained. The restricted corridor looked exactly as it had before. Cold lights, empty hallways, endless steel. Ethan followed the diagnostic signal until he reached the observation station positioned outside the isolated containment wing. The room was small, barely large enough for a workstation and a wall of surveillance monitors. Most of the screens displayed empty corridors. One screen showed a maintenance tunnel. Another displayed a storage room. Then his eyes stopped on a feed labeled 47. The camera was active. For the first time, Ethan saw inside. The room was larger than he expected. Not luxurious. Not comfortable. Simply clean and bare. A narrow bed stood against one wall. Shelves filled with books lined another. Soft white lighting illuminated the space with an almost artificial calm. Near a large window made of transparent alloy, a young woman sat cross-legged on the floor. Ethan blinked. She looked nothing like the stories whispered throughout the prison. Her skin carried a deep sapphire hue that shimmered faintly beneath the light. Silver-white hair fell across her shoulders. She wore a simple gray uniform. No restraints. No signs of aggression. No signs of danger. In her hands rested a small bird. Ethan leaned closer to the screen. The creature appeared injured. One wing hung awkwardly at its side. The woman carefully wrapped the wing with a strip of cloth torn from an old sleeve. Her movements were gentle, patient. Every few moments, she spoke softly to the animal in a language Ethan did not recognize. The bird responded with tiny chirps. He found himself staring in disbelief. This was the prisoner everyone feared. The person locked away behind the most secure containment system in the facility. A woman spending her afternoon helping a wounded creature barely larger than her hand. The monitor crackled briefly. The woman suddenly froze. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her violet eyes turned directly toward the camera. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. For several seconds, she simply looked at the lens. Not angry, not hostile, just aware. Then something unexpected happened. She offered a small smile. Not to the camera, not to the prison. Somehow it felt directed at him. The lights flickered overhead. The smile disappeared. She lowered her gaze and returned her attention to the bird. But Ethan remained motionless. Because for the first time since arriving on Helios, one thought became impossible to ignore. If everyone was right about her, then why did she look like the only person in the prison who still remembered how to be kind? The next morning, Ethan returned to Sector 7 for a reason he could not fully justify. Officially, he was inspecting a recurring fault in the environmental monitoring network. Unofficially, he wanted to know whether the woman on the surveillance screen had been real or simply a trick of perspective and isolation. The storm had passed during the night. Pale sunlight filtered through narrow observation windows high above the prison complex. Frost clung to exterior walls like silver dust. Deep underground, however, nothing seemed to change. The same cold corridors stretched endlessly ahead. The same silence followed every footstep. Ethan arrived at the observation station shortly after 9 o'clock. The room was empty. He powered up the maintenance console and began reviewing system diagnostics. Numbers scrolled across the display. Air circulation normal. Temperature stable. Camera network operational. Everything appeared routine. Yet his eyes kept drifting toward the monitor marked 47. Eventually, curiosity won. He opened the camera feed. The room looked different today. A small collection of books rested on the floor beside the window. The injured bird sat perched on a shelf near the bed. Its wing appeared stronger, and the woman was reading. Sunlight from the transparent alloy window illuminated strands of silver hair as she turned pages one at a time. The scene felt strangely peaceful, more like a quiet apartment than a high-security containment chamber. Ethan found himself wondering what she was reading, what music she sang when nobody listened, what 12 years of isolation did to a person's thoughts. As if sensing his attention, she suddenly looked toward the camera again. This time her gaze lingered. Ethan expected her to look away. Instead, she slowly closed the book and stood. He realized for the first time that she was taller than he had assumed. Graceful, calm. She crossed the room and stopped directly beneath the camera. For several seconds, neither moved. Then she tilted her head slightly, almost curious. Ethan felt ridiculous standing there staring at a monitor. Yet he could not bring himself to look away. The woman lifted one hand. Not a wave, not a gesture asking for help, merely an acknowledgement. The simple recognition that another person existed beyond the walls surrounding her. Something tightened in Ethan's chest. Before he could think better of it, he activated the maintenance intercom connected to the observation systems. The microphone indicator glowed green. His finger hovered over the transmit button. Every training guideline told him not to engage. Every warning he had heard echoed through his mind. Dangerous. Restricted. Do not get involved. Yet none of those warnings matched the person standing on the screen. Ethan pressed the button. Hello. The words sounded surprisingly loud in the quiet room. On the monitor, her eyes widened slightly. Silence followed. A long silence. Then she stepped closer to the camera. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he expected. Calm. Careful. As though she had not used it often. You are new. Ethan blinked. Of all the things she could have said, that was not what he expected. How did you know? A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. Because the others stopped saying hello years ago. The line went quiet again. Somewhere in the distance, machinery hummed behind steel walls. Ethan searched for something meaningful to say. Nothing came. For the first time since arriving on Helios, he understood something important. The prison had spent 12 years studying the woman in cell 47. Yet apparently nobody had bothered to simply speak with her. After that first conversation, Ethan told himself he would keep his distance. He lasted less than 24 hours. The next afternoon, he found another excuse to visit the observation station. Then another the day after that. Soon the routine became as natural as checking maintenance reports. Every morning, he inspected systems across the prison. Every afternoon, he spent a few minutes in Sector 7. At first, their conversations were brief. Simple questions. Simple answers. He learned that she preferred reading physical books over digital archives. She learned that Ethan grew up in northern Montana where winter storms could bury entire roads beneath snowdrifts. Sometimes long silences settled between them. Neither seemed uncomfortable with that. In a place where every sound echoed through steel corridors, silence felt strangely honest. A week later, Ethan arrived carrying a small maintenance case. The woman sat near the window with the bird perched on her shoulder. The creature looked healthier now. Its damaged wing had healed enough for short flights across the room. Good afternoon, Ethan said through the intercom. Good afternoon, Ethan Walker. He blinked. You remember my full name. A faint smile appeared. You are the first new person I have met in 12 years. It would be strange not to remember. Ethan opened the maintenance case and removed a small object. I found something during storage inventory. He held up an old chess set. Real wood. Hand-carved. Several pieces showed signs of wear. Do you know how to play? Her violet eyes widened slightly. My father taught me. The answer came so quickly that it surprised both of them. The smile faded almost immediately afterward. Ethan noticed it. So did she. For a moment, something sad flickered behind her calm expression. He decided not to press further. Instead, he positioned a portable camera above the board and arranged the pieces. White or black? He asked. The question seemed so ordinary inside a maximum security prison that she actually laughed. The sound was soft and unexpected. Ethan realized it was the first time he had heard genuine amusement in her voice. White, she said. For the next hour, they played through the camera feed. Move by move. Piece by piece. The conversation flowed more naturally than before. She spoke about books. About music. About strange constellations visible from worlds Ethan had never heard of. Yet whenever discussion drifted toward her past, she carefully redirected it elsewhere. Not evasive, just cautious, as though certain memories carried too much weight. Halfway through the game, the bird landed beside the chessboard and knocked over a pawn. Ethan laughed. That seems unfair. He disagrees with your strategy, she replied. Smart bird. Very smart bird. Another laugh followed. Small. Genuine. Human. Ethan found himself smiling at the monitor. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the mountains surrounding Helios. The storm clouds had finally disappeared. Golden sunlight filtered through the transparent alloy window inside her room. For a few minutes, the prison seemed farther away than usual. Not gone, just distant, as though steel walls and security systems mattered a little less than they had before. Eventually, Ethan noticed the time and began packing away the chess set. I should get back to work. She nodded. Of course. Yet something about her expression changed. The room suddenly felt larger, quieter. The familiar loneliness returned like a shadow crossing sunlight. Ethan hesitated. Would you like to continue tomorrow? For a second, she looked genuinely surprised. Then she lowered her gaze toward the chessboard. Yes, she said softly. I would like that. As Ethan left the observation station, he realized something important. Everyone in Helios spoke about containment systems, security risks, and classified files. Nobody spoke about the woman herself. Nobody mentioned that after 12 years alone, the thing she seemed to value most was not freedom, answers, or revenge. It was simply having someone return the next day. 2 weeks passed before Ethan finally asked the question that had been following him since his first day at Helios. The opportunity came during another chess game. Outside the prison, snow drifted across the mountain ridges beneath a pale afternoon sky. Inside cell 47, Lyra sat beside the window while the small bird rested comfortably on the shelf above her books. Their routine had become familiar. A few games of chess, a conversation, a quiet goodbye. Yet beneath the comfort of that routine, unanswered questions remained. Ethan moved a knight across the board. "Can I ask you something?" Lyra studied the screen. "You usually do. Why are you here?" The room fell silent. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. Lyra lowered her eyes to the chessboard. For several seconds, she did not move. Ethan immediately regretted asking. "You do not have to answer." "No," she said softly. "Perhaps it is time someone asked." She stood and walked toward the transparent alloy window. Snow-covered peaks stretched across the horizon beyond the prison walls. The sunlight reflected against her sapphire skin with a faint silver glow. "What have they told you about me?" Ethan hesitated. "Not much. Only that you are dangerous." A small smile appeared. It was not amused. It was tired. "That word has followed me for most of my life." She rested one hand against the glass. "Do you know what my people called me before that?" Ethan shook his head. "A listener." The word lingered in the air. "What does that mean?" Lyra watched the distant mountains. "Some species communicate through language. Some through technology. My people evolved differently. We feel emotions more strongly than most civilizations." Ethan frowned slightly. "Empathy. Something similar." She searched for the right words. "When another person experiences grief, fear, loneliness, or hope, I can sense it." Ethan blinked. "You can read minds?" "No." Her answer came immediately. "Thoughts are private. I cannot hear thoughts. I cannot control anyone. I cannot force feelings. I only sense what already exists." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "That does not sound dangerous." Lyra laughed quietly. "It depends who is afraid." The statement stayed with him. "People were scared of you because you could feel emotions?" She nodded. "Imagine standing before someone who always knows when you are afraid, or guilty, or lying to yourself." Ethan understood then. Not completely, but enough. "So they locked you away?" "Eventually." Her voice remained calm, yet Ethan noticed her fingers tightened slightly against the window frame. Many leaders disliked being understood too clearly. The room grew quiet again. Somewhere deep within the prison, ventilation systems hummed through steel ducts. Snow continued drifting beyond the glass. Ethan stared at the chessboard but no longer saw the pieces. For weeks he had expected some hidden secret, some terrifying revelation. Instead, he found himself listening to a woman whose greatest crime seemed to be understanding people too well. Then Lyra suddenly turned toward the camera. Her violet eyes focused directly on him. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why do you keep coming back?" Ethan opened his mouth and stopped. The answer should have been simple. Curiosity, friendship, concern. Yet none of those felt complete. Finally, he shrugged. "Because every person I meet here talks about what you are." Lyra remained silent. "You are the only one who talks about people." For the first time since he had known her, genuine emotion appeared. Openly on her face. Not sadness. Not loneliness. Something warmer. Something almost like gratitude. And at that moment, Ethan realized the strangest truth of all. The woman everyone feared possessed an ability centered entirely around understanding others. The prison called that dangerous. Ethan was beginning to wonder if it was the exact opposite. 3 days later, everything changed. Ethan discovered it by accident. The maintenance archives occupied a forgotten corner of the administration level. Most employees avoided the room because searching old records was slow, tedious work. Ethan normally avoided it too. That afternoon, he was tracking a recurring fault in the prison database when a restricted file appeared briefly on his screen before vanishing. He almost ignored it. Almost. The title caught his attention. Subject 47. Initial classification review. His pulse quickened. Access denied messages filled the display when he attempted to open it directly. Yet a fragment remained cached inside the maintenance system. Not enough for a complete report. Just enough to raise questions. Ethan spent the next hour following disconnected references through decades of archived records. The deeper he searched, the stranger the story became. There were transportation logs without destinations. Security reports with entire pages removed. Medical evaluations containing blank sections where conclusions should have been. Most disturbing of all, Every document seemed determined to avoid one simple detail. Nobody described an actual crime. Long after his shift ended, Ethan sat alone beneath the pale glow of archive monitors. Outside, snow tapped softly against reinforced windows. The prison had settled into its nighttime rhythm. Automated announcements echoed through distant corridors. Somewhere above, a cargo shuttle landed on the western platform. Then he found something. A maintenance request filed 12 years earlier. Ordinary. Forgotten. Easy to overlook. Attached to it was a transfer authorization bearing Lyra's name. Ethan opened the record. His eyes moved slowly across the screen. Age at arrival. 22. Health condition. Stable. Threat assessment. Pending. Threat assessment pending. Ethan read the line 3 times. When Lyra first arrived, nobody had classified her as dangerous. The designation came later. Days later. Maybe weeks. He leaned back in his chair. A cold feeling settled in his stomach. The story everyone repeated throughout Helios suddenly made less sense. If she had been considered a threat from the beginning, the classification would have existed immediately. Instead, it appeared afterward. Something had changed. Or someone had changed it. The following afternoon, Ethan returned to Sector 7 carrying questions he could not ignore. Lyra was seated near the window reading when the monitor activated. The bird rested comfortably beside her. "You seem troubled today," she said before he spoke a single word. Ethan almost laughed. Is it really that obvious? Only to someone who spends her life observing people. He sat down across from the camera. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Ethan asked, "When you arrived here, were you already classified as dangerous?" The question struck her like an unexpected gust of wind. Not fear. Surprise. Genuine surprise. Slowly, she closed her book. No. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. Then what happened? Lyra looked toward the mountains beyond the transparent window. Evening sunlight painted the distant snowfields gold. I told the truth. The answer was simple. Too simple. About what? She remained silent for so long that Ethan wondered whether she would answer at all. Then her voice came quietly. About something powerful people wanted hidden. Ethan stared at the screen. What kind of truth? A faint sadness touched her expression. The kind that becomes more dangerous than lies. Before Ethan could respond, warning lights suddenly flashed across his tablet. Incoming administrative override. Archive access review initiated. His blood ran cold. Someone had noticed his searches. Across the screen, Lyra seemed to understand immediately. Ethan. What? Her violet eyes held his. Calm. Steady. Concerned. Be careful what questions you ask. Some prisons are built from walls. She glanced briefly toward the camera. Others are built from secrets. That night, Ethan did not sleep. The warning from the archive system replayed through his mind again and again. Someone had noticed his searches. Someone cared enough to monitor records that were more than a decade old. Outside his quarters, the prison settled into silence. Snow drifted across the mountain ridges beneath a sky crowded with stars. Inside, the glow of his tablet illuminated scattered maintenance reports he no longer pretended to read. Shortly after midnight, another notification appeared. Administrative Directive. Mandatory Systems Review. Sector 7. Scheduled for 72 hours from now. Ethan frowned. The message looked routine at first glance. Then he noticed the authorization codes attached to it. Executive clearance. Interstellar oversight. Levels far above anything normally associated with a single prisoner. A cold feeling settled in his chest. The next afternoon, he returned to the observation station. Lyra seemed to sense his unease immediately. The chessboard remained untouched. Even the bird sat quietly near the window. Something happened, she said. Ethan nodded. There is a review scheduled. Her expression did not change. I know. That answer stopped him. How? A faint smile touched her lips. People become predictable when they are afraid. Ethan leaned forward. Afraid of what? For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she walked toward the camera. The afternoon sunlight behind her cast long shadows across the room. Do you remember what I told you about being a listener? Yes. There is more. Her voice remained calm. 12 years ago, I served as an advisor to several governments. Not because I held power, because I could sense when entire populations were becoming fearful. Ethan listened carefully. Fear of what? A disaster. The word hung in the air. A real one. She nodded slowly. A chain of environmental failures spreading across multiple colonies. Resource shortages. System collapses. Displacement. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He remembered studying historical records during school. There had been a crisis roughly 12 years earlier. Millions affected. Entire settlements relocated. Official investigations blamed. Unpredictable conditions. You tried to warn them. Yes. Her violet eyes held his. The data was clear. The emotions were clearer. Entire worlds were afraid long before leaders admitted anything was wrong. Ethan stared at the monitor. And they ignored you? A sad smile appeared. At first, the room seemed smaller suddenly. Quieter. What happened after that? Lyra looked toward the mountains beyond her window. The crisis arrived exactly as predicted. Ethan felt the pieces beginning to connect. People demanded answers. They demanded someone to blame. The silence that followed felt heavier than any prison wall. Ethan finally understood. The danger had never been her ability. The danger had been her accuracy. She had warned them. They had ignored her. Then reality proved her right. So they locked you away. Lyra nodded once. A warning that comes true is often remembered longer than the people who ignored it. Ethan looked down at the review notice still displayed on his tablet. What happens in 72 hours? For the first time since he had met her, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. I do not know. Outside the transparent window, clouds began gathering over the distant mountains. Shadows moved across the snowfields. The bird fluttered from its perch and landed gently beside her. Lyra watched the horizon for several moments before speaking again. But whatever decision they have made, it means someone finally remembers, I am still here. Ethan stared at the screen long after the conversation ended. Because deep inside, he had begun to suspect something far more troubling than a forgotten prisoner. Someone at the highest levels of authority had spent 12 years keeping the truth behind cell 47 buried. And now, for reasons he could not yet see, that truth was starting to matter again. 72 hours later, the review committee arrived beneath a sky the color of steel. Their shuttle descended through drifting snow and settled on the western platform, while security teams escorted officials into the administrative wing. Rumors spread through Helios faster than any official announcement. Nobody knew why leaders from multiple systems had traveled across half the galaxy for a single prisoner. Ethan spent the morning pretending to focus on maintenance reports. By noon, he could no longer concentrate. Every corridor felt tense. Every conversation stopped when supervisors approached. Shortly after 2 o'clock, a notification appeared on his tablet. Sector 7. Administrative observation authorized. His heart pounded as he made his way underground. The observation station was crowded for the first time since his arrival. Officials stood behind transparent partitions reviewing documents and surveillance feeds. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked exhausted. A few avoided looking at the main monitor entirely. On the screen, Lyra sat quietly beside the window. The bird rested on her shoulder. She appeared calmer than anyone in the room. Hours passed. Files were reviewed. Archive communications surfaced. Historical reports appeared on display screens one after another. Ethan watched expressions change as forgotten records were examined. The same pattern repeated again and again. Predictions ignored. Warnings dismissed. Evidence buried. By early evening, the atmosphere inside the station felt completely different. Not hostile. Not fearful. Reflective. As if people were finally seeing the past without the stories built around it. Then the decision arrived. A single document appeared on every monitor simultaneously. Administrative classification revoked. Long-term containment terminated. Ethan stared at the words. Around him, nobody spoke. The silence felt almost sacred. Several minutes later, security protocols disengaged throughout Sector 7. Deep mechanical sounds echoed through the underground levels. Locks released one by one. Systems that had remained active for 12 years finally powered down. Ethan found himself standing before the containment corridor. For the first time, the massive door at the end stood without warning lights or security barriers. The steel surface looked strangely ordinary now. Just a door. Nothing more. The final lock clicked open. Slowly, the entrance slid aside. Warm light spilled into the hallway. Lyra stood inside. She did not rush forward. She did not celebrate. For several seconds, she simply looked beyond the threshold. Ethan could not imagine what 12 years felt like compressed into a single moment. Then she took one step forward. And another. The bird fluttered upward and disappeared into the open corridor ahead. Lyra watched it go with a faint smile. Beyond the containment wing, an observation balcony overlooked the mountains surrounding Helios. Snow glittered beneath the setting sun. Clouds burned gold and crimson across the horizon. Ethan walked beside her in silence as they reached the overlook. The cold evening air touched her face for the first time in more than a decade. She closed her eyes briefly, not to escape the moment, To feel it, the wind, the sunlight, the vastness of an open sky. When she finally opened her eyes again, they reflected the colors of the sunset. What will you do now? Ethan asked softly. Lyra looked toward the distant horizon where the last light of day met the mountains. Live, she answered. Then she glanced at him. And perhaps remind people that understanding each other is not something to fear. Below them, lights slowly illuminated across the prison complex as evening settled over Helios. For the first time since Ethan arrived, the fortress no longer felt like a monument to fear. It felt like a place learning from its mistakes. Neither spoke again for several minutes. They simply stood there watching the stars emerge one by one above the mountains. Somewhere in the distance a bird crossed the darkening sky. And in the quiet that followed, Ethan finally understood why the most dangerous thing in the prison had never been the woman behind the door. It had been the decision to stop listening to her.